Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to work on the Chapter 7 review. I can factor anything worksheet. I'm fighting against my headset battery dying, so this is going to be fast, and I'm only going to do I'll tell you what, one looks like a challenge, so I'm going to do the evens for this. So I look at number 2 and I ask myself, because the directions say factor out the common factor out of each expression. So when I'm factoring out the GCF, I'm thinking about what's the biggest number and what's the biggest variable that I can take from each term. Remember, terms are separated by plus and minus signs. So in this particular case, I look at 12x squared plus 16x plus 12, and the first thing I notice is not each one of those terms has an x to give, and so there will be no x in my GCF. So I look at 12, 16, and 12, and I think about the biggest number that goes into all of those numbers, and I believe it's going to be 4. So I'm going to bring a 4 out front, and I'm going to say 4 times what? 4 times 3x squared gives me 12x squared. 4 times 4x gives me 16x, and 4 times 12 gives, or excuse me, 4 times 3 gives me 12. So before I declare myself finished and move on, I just want to look at the things that are left inside the parenthesis and determine, is that the biggest? Was there something more that could come out? One's even, one's odd. There's not an x for each one. I feel confident that that 4 is the greatest common factor for each of those terms. My directions continue to be factor the greatest common factor out of each expression. So I look at number 4 and I say, all right, I notice that the first two terms have y's and the third term has an x and the fourth term has no variable at all. So I cannot take any x's or any y's out of all 4 terms. So now I look and I want to figure out what the biggest factor for each one is number-wise: 12, 18, 48, and 24. And the first thing that pops into my head is they're all even, so I know 2 can come out. But I look at 12 and 18 and I go, both of those are multiples of 6. Is 48 a multiple of 6? Yeah, 48 times, or 6 times 8 is 48, and 24, does 6 go into 24? Yes. So I'm going to see if 6 is my greatest common factor. So I'm going to set it up and I'm going to say 6 times what gives me 12y squared? Well, 6 times 2, y to the 7th gives me 12y to the 7th. 6 times what gives me 18y squared? So times 3y squared. 6 times what gives me negative 48? Well, 6 times negative 8, so 6 times negative 8x. And then I look at the last term and say 6 times 4 gives me 24. And I look at each one of those and I go, I've got a 2 and a 3. There is no common factor for 2 and 3, aside from 1, that will come out of there. I know that I have, for all 4 terms, 6 is the GCF. Number 7, my directions say factor completely. So the first thing I'm going to do is put it in standard form, and it's in standard form, so that's good news. The second thing is I'm going to check to see if I have a GCF. I do not have a GCF. So now I am going to group my first 2 terms together and my second 2 terms. Woo, coming off the board, sorry about that. And I think about the first set of parentheses, and I ask myself what the biggest factor for each of those 2 terms is. And I say, well, 28 divided by 7 works, and 7, all right, so my GCF for the first set of parentheses is 7 for the number, and what's the most number of m's I can take out? Well, we wrote down in our notes that when we were factoring out variables, we looked at the one with the smallest exponent, and that was the one that could come out. So I can take out m squared. I'm going to draw my parentheses in. 7m times what is going to give me 28m cubed? Well, 7 times 4 and m. So 7 times 4 is 28. M squared times m is m cubed. So I look at negative 7m squared. 7m times what will give me negative 7m squared? Well, negative 1. So that works. Now I'm going to look at the second set of parentheses, 24m, negative 24m plus 6. So I think about my GCF and I notice that 24 is divisible by 6, so that's going to be my GCF. But we wrote down a rule that said if the first term was negative, then we would make our GCF negative. So I'm going to say negative 6 times what gives me negative 24m? Well, that's going to be 4m. Negative 6 times what is going to give me positive 6? Negative 6 times negative 1 is going to give me positive 6. And now I look and see that I have a term or a factor in common for each one of those. So because I have that in both terms, I'm going to bring that out front and say 4m minus 1 times 7m squared minus 6. And that's my final answer for number 6. For number 8, I put it in standard form. Check, it's already in standard form. Can I take out a GCF? Well, 5 and 40 have a GCF, but not 7. So I don't have a GCF for all 4 terms. So now I'm going to group things together. So I'm going to put parentheses there and there, and I'm going to look at the first set of parentheses, and I'm going to think about the greatest common factor for 5x cubed and negative 40x squared. So I know that 5 is the biggest number that goes into both 5 and 40, and my rule said when I'm factoring out variables, I take the one with the smallest exponent. So I have 5x squared. 5x times x will give me 5x cubed. 5x times negative 8 will give me negative 40x squared. Moving on to the second set of parentheses, I think about the GCF for negative 7x plus 56, and I know that negative 7 is the biggest number that goes into both of those things. So now I say negative 7 times x will give me negative 7x, and negative 7 times negative 8 will give me positive 64. And once again, I find that I have a common factor, so I'm going to bring that out. I'm factoring it out. So I'm going to write it out front, x minus 8 times 5x squared minus 7. That is my final answer for number 8. For number 10, okay, I do not have a GCF, and my directions are still factor completely. So at this point, I'm going to use my AC factorization. So I'm going to say AC and B. A times C is negative 10, and B, and we wrote this on top, right? And B was positive 3. And we write down factors of negative 10. So 1 and 10, 2 and 5, and that's it, right? So now I'm going to think about if I have negative 10, my numbers are multiplying to negative 10. One has to be positive and one has to be negative. Well, what combination of positive and negative for these factors will give me 3 as my final answer? Well, there's no way I can add and subtract 1 and 10 to get to 3. But if I look at negative 2 and positive 5, that would add up to 3, right? And it would multiply to negative 10. So now I'm going to add in my middle terms. So I bring down my first term, I bring down my last term, and then I write in my middle terms. So I'm going to put in negative 2x and positive 5x. And now I'm going to go back and factor by grouping. So I'm going to put in parentheses here and here and here and here. For the first set of parentheses, what is my GCF? My GCF is only x. I'm going to bring that out front, and I'm going to have x minus 2. My second set of parentheses, my GCF for 5x and 10, well, my biggest common factor is going to be 5. And when I pull that out, 5 times what gives me 5x? Well, that's going to be x. 5 times what is going to give me negative 10? Well, that's negative 2. So I pull x minus 2 up front, and I put my two coefficients, my other factors, in another set of parentheses, x plus 5. And that is my final answer for number 10. For number 12, do I have a GCF? So when I think about things that go into 9 and 24, well, 9 is 1, 3, and 9. Those are the only factors of 9. 24 has a 3. 16 does not. So there is no GCF for 9, 24, and 16. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make my ACT chart. And I'm going to think about 9 times 16. So negative 9 times negative 16 gives me positive 144. And I'm going to think about ways that I can factor 144 that are going to add up to negative 24. So one of the first things I do when I have a big number is I write down the two factors that got me there to start with, 9 and 16. But I can't get 9 and 16 to add or subtract to negative 24, so I'm going to have to think more. Obviously, there's 1 and 144. I'm not even going to write that down because that doesn't even come close. Hopefully, you're yelling at your YouTube, 12 and 12, right? Because the square root of 144 is 12. And so I say 12 and 12, and how can I get those two things to multiply to be positive 144 and add to be negative 144? Well, if I make them both negative, they add up to be negative 24. So that's my winner. Can I get it? Ding, ding, ding. All right, so I'm going to insert my middle terms. I'm going to bring down my first term. I'm going to bring down my last term, and my middle terms are going to be minus 12x and minus 12x. I'm going to factor by grouping, so now I'm going to put in parentheses for both sets of common factors, or both the front two and the last two. I'm going to look at my GCF for the first set of parentheses. For 9 and 12, the biggest thing that they have in common, well, that's going to be 3x. But we had a rule that we wrote down. If the first term was negative, we were going to bring out a negative GCF. So my GCF is negative 3x. I'm going to draw in my parentheses. Negative 3x times what gives me negative 9x squared? Well, that's going to be positive 3x. Negative 3x times what is going to give me negative 12x? Well, that's going to be positive 4. My second set of parentheses, my GCF for negative 12 and negative 16 is going to be negative 4. That's the biggest number that goes into both 12 and 16. My first term is negative, so my GCF will be negative. Negative 4 times what gives me negative 12? Well, that's going to be positive 3x. Negative 4 times what gives me negative 16? That's going to be positive 4. I notice once again that I have 3x plus 4 as a common factor for both of these things, so I'm going to factor it out front. I'm going to write 3x plus 4 times negative 3x minus 4. Is that okay? That is perfectly okay.
Michael Narrow, please come to the office. Michael Narrow to the office, please.
Number 14, so I consider my GCF. I've got negative 20, 66, and 108. So I don't actually know. I can see that they're all divisible by 2, but I don't know if they're all divisible by 4. So I'm going to divide 66 by 4 and see if that gets me anywhere. Nope, 66 is not evenly divisible by 4. So I'm going to factor out a 2, but we had a rule that said if my first term was negative, I would factor out a negative number. So I'm going to say negative 2 times, negative 2 times positive 10x squared would give me negative 20x. This becomes negative. Negative 2 times what will give me positive 66x? Well, half of 66 is, so it's going to be negative 33x. And then I have to say negative 2 times what will give me positive 108? And that's going to be negative 54. And this is going to be a fun challenge, right? Because I need to multiply. There's no other GCF that I can see. So now I'm going to come over here and set up my AC chart. So AC and B. A times C is going to be negative 540. Oh my word, that's huge. And my B is going to be negative 33. Well, the first thing that I do when I've got big numbers is I start with 10 and 54 because that was the set of numbers that got me there in the first place. And I really don't know what the answer for this is. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to start typing stuff in. And I'm going to go a little bit bigger. So I'm going to start with 11. Nope. Divided by 12. 45. 12 and 45. Can I make one of those positive and one negative, because when they multiply together, it has to be negative, and get them to add up to negative 33? I think so. I think that if I choose negative 45 and positive 12, they will multiply to be negative 540, and they will add to negative 33. So I think that's my winner. So I'm going to come over here, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down that negative 2. I'm not going to stop writing it, because the minute I stop writing it, I'm going to forget about it, and my answer is going to be wrong. So I'm going to bring down that negative 2. All right, I'm going to draw my parentheses, and I'm going to put in my middle terms. I'm going to bring down my first term, I'm going to bring down my last term, and I'm going to insert my middle terms, which are positive 12x and negative 45x. And here's the thing, I know somebody's out there, and I know what her name is. Anna Deegan, I'm looking at you. She's all upset because it would make more sense to put 45 and 10 together, but let's live dangerously. We could do it either way. So I'm going to bring down the negative 2, and I'm going to factor, so I'm going to put in some parentheses up here. I'm going to put parentheses there and parentheses here. All right, so the biggest common factor for 10x squared and 12x is just 2x. So I'm going to get 2x, and then 2x times what gives me 10x squared? Well, that's going to be 5x. 2x times what is going to give me 12x? That's 6. Second set of parentheses. What is the biggest thing that 45 and 54 have in common? Well, I'm actually pretty good at my nines tables, and I recognize right off the bat that 9 is divisible into both of those numbers. My first term is negative, so it's going to be negative 9. My set of parentheses. Negative 9 times what gives me negative 45x? Well, that's 5x. Negative 9 times what gives me negative 54? Well, that's plus 6. All right. I'm going to bring down that negative 2 so I don't forget about it. And now I recognize that I have 5x plus 6 and 5x plus 6. I'm going to bring that out front. And then I'm going to put this and another set of parentheses. So 2x minus 9. And if I took a minute to multiply all of that out, in the end, I would end up right back here. So I can always check my work. Number 16. Oh my goodness. So 75a squared minus 27. All right, so I'm going to think about 27, and okay, my headset just died, so I've charged it up for a little bit, and we'll see how much more we can get done. When it beeps at me again, that's when the video ends. So if it feels like I'm stopping abruptly, it's because the video or my headset has died. So I'm going to think about the factors of 27. So I know that 3 and 9 go into 27. So really the factors of 27 are 1, 3, 9, and 27. So of those, I know that 9 doesn't go into 75, and I'm pretty certain that 27 doesn't go into 75. So I'm going to say 75 divided by 3, and hopefully you think of money and go, well, that's just 25. So I am going to factor out a 3, and that's going to give me 25a squared minus 9. Now, I look at this, and because I have two terms, I can go straight to parentheses because I recognize that I have a perfect square in the first spot. So 25a squared is a perfect square and 9 is a perfect square. I have a minus sign, so what I have is a difference of two squares. I'm going to bring down the 3 because I can't stop writing that, otherwise I'll forget about it. I'm going to do two sets of parentheses. The square root of 25a squared goes in both of these first places. The square root of 25a squared is 5a. I'm going to put the square root of 9 in the second spot. The square root of 9 is 3. I'm going to put a plus sign here and a minus sign there. So my final answer is 3 times 5a plus 3 times 5a minus 3. And if you take a minute to multiply all of that out, you're going to end up right back at the beginning. And let's do that. So I'm going to take 5a and multiply it by 5a. That gives me 25a squared. 5a times negative 3 is negative 15a. 3 times 5a is 15a, and positive 3 times negative 3 is negative 9. Now I have to remember to bring down that 3. So I'm going to combine like terms, so I get 25a squared. These two things, well, they just cancel each other out. So we end up with this. I need to distribute that 3 to both pieces. 25a squared times 3 is 75a squared minus 27. And that is exactly where we started. So yay us. All right, let's take a look at number 18. So this looks like we've already done it. We've already had this problem. All right, we haven't already had this problem. 9 and 24, 3 goes into 24. It does not go into 16. There is no GCF. So I'm going to come over here and do my AC chart and my B. 9 times 16, 9 times 16 gives me 144. I think we had a negative version of this. And my B is 24. So I'm going to think about factors of 144. I did 9 and 16 to get me there, but that does not add up to 24. It adds up to 25. But if you're thinking about the square root of 144 being 12, you get 12 and 12. And when both of those are positive, that adds up to 24. So that's my winner. So I'm going to write 9x squared. I'm going to insert my middle terms, plus 12x plus 12x, and bring down my last term, which is 16. I'm going to factor by grouping, so I'm going to put in my parentheses. I'm going to look at my first set of parentheses and say that my GCF is 3x. 3x times 3x gives me 9x squared. 3x times positive 4 gives me 12x. I look at my second set of parentheses. 4 is my GCF. So I'm going to write positive 4. 4 times 3x gives me 12x. 4 times 4 gives me 16. At this point, I'm going to bring out my 3x plus 4. And in my second set of parentheses, 3x plus 4. And one of the things that we learned was we could write that like this. 3x plus 4 quantity squared is how we say that. And that's it, folks. And I need to hop out of here before my headset dies. If you have any questions, let me know via email. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.